Look, originally, I wasn't going to cover this movie. So much has been said about what a colossal disaster this movie is that it felt redundant to do so. I also hadn't seen it, and fully didn't intend to at first, but curiosity got the better of me. And now I have seen it. And now I have to make this video, so that my suffering won't have been completely in vain. So yeah, The Flash is a very, very terrible movie. On pretty much every level possible, from how it adapts the comic material, to the fan service, to the dialogue, it is broken. I mean, sure, I shouldn't be surprised. After all, this movie spent nearly a decade in development hell and was released just in time to be made pretty much redundant by the upcoming DCU reboot. While there are 4 writers' credits on the film, rumors abound that about 10 times that many worked on it at some point. But even with that in mind, it is truly mind-blowing how terrible this movie gets. In fact, in my eyes, it represents everything that is wrong with the way superhero and nerd media is written in the modern age. The plague of soulless fan service, the lazy writing that stitches that fan service together, and the consistent insults to the intelligence of the viewer. This is not just a terrible movie, it is the example of terrible contemporary comic book filmmaking. And unless something changes soon, it will be the death flag of the entire genre. So yeah, this movie fucking sucks. Let's break it down. Ugh. You think this is a bit, don't you? I think by now everybody knows the plot to this movie, but for those who don't, here's a speed run of the most important plot points so I don't sound like a crazy person when I refer back to them later. Have you ever read Flashpoint? It's that, but worse. Okay, for those of you who haven't read Flashpoint or seen season 3 of the TV show of The Flash, this is the gist. This is Barry Allen. He's the fastest man alive. One day, while being sad about his mum being dead, oh yeah, his mum's dead, he runs so fast he goes back in time to a few hours before, when he saved a literal hospital wing of falling babies. Realizing this is something he can do, despite already knowing he could time travel before this, he decides he's gonna go back in time to stop his mother from being murdered. Unfortunately for him, this messes up the timeline. Batman is now Michael Keaton, Kara Zor-El landed on Earth instead of Kal-El, Eric Stoltz was in Back to the Future instead of Michael J. Fox. Shit is weird. So anyway, Barry ends up in 2013 because of this asshole I won't come back to, where he meets his former self. Here on in, this one is Barry 1, this one is Barry 2. Barry 1 realizes that Zod's attack on Earth from Man of Steel is about to happen, so they go to Batman to help find Superman. Instead, they find Kara, and the 4 of them go to fight Zod. They all fail, and Barry 1 realizes that this timeline is just basically doomed, and the only way to save the world is to let his mum get murdered. So, you know, he does that, and all is fixed. Except now, Batman is George Clooney because, that is basically all of the relevant information for this movie. Now, let's get into the finer details. I have seen some butt-ugly movies in my short and, so far, unremarkable time on this planet Earth. And holy shit, is this movie one of them? It's not just that the visual effects in this movie are absolute bollocks. That is a massive factor of it, and I will come back to that. But it's also the complete lack of any personality in the filmmaking, which is disappointing because Andy Muschietti is capable of style. His take on Stephen King's It has its flaws, like the second part being nearly 3 hours long for no reason, but they had a compelling kind of gritty style to them, or at least the first one did. But here, there's no sign of any of that. Instead, the movie looks like it's been polished within an inch of its life, the result being that it feels almost clinical. There's no warmth or heart to any of it. Okay, that's not quite true. There seem to be attempts at stylizing the movie, those being saturated colors and this cyan tint that's all over the movie, except for when it isn't. Back when I did my Trash Talk series about Zack Snyder that I've since unlisted because I don't like it very much, I talked about how those movies were devoid of saturation, becoming largely grey and unappealing movies. Given that, you'd think I'd be delighted by this movie. But no, it's too far the other way. Saturated colors in comic book movies are, as far as I'm concerned, the way to go. It's why I've come to hate the overall visual presentation of the MCU. But if you push that saturation too far, it becomes less stylized and more uncanny. This movie crosses that line. The cyan tint aids in that distracting look, making the movie look a lot colder. The thing is, it's pretty easy to fix this problem. You don't even have to turn the saturation down heaps to make an improvement, and if you know what you're doing, the tint is easy to correct for, but if it was so easy, why not just do that? Of course, the saturated look actually underlines the movie's other massive flaw, the hideous visual effects. Now, there are hints of good ideas in the VFX of this movie. For example, I like the red tint when Barry 1 is running. You know, something redshift. That's not really how redshift works, I don't think. But it's an interesting visual nonetheless. But everything else is pants. I won't make fun of the slipshot assembly of the fight scenes here, because everybody else has done that. I won't have a go at these horribly rendered Uncanny Valley CGI faces, because everyone else has done that too. Instead, I want to take a look at this effect they did for the Speed Force as a whole, because it baffles me. This sphere of memory things, I don't get it. The idea of the Speed Force sequences here is that Barry is running back in time. Convention would suggest him running through a tunnel of lights and colors with memories coming at him as he does. If they did this, it would be a little on the cliche side, but it would work. But instead we have this visualization which fundamentally doesn't work. For a start, it means that it looks like Barry's running on the spot in the middle of this memory sphere, which looks fatally silly. But more to the point, you lose the sense that this speed has become so unimaginable that he's time traveling. Instead, it looks like shit. Which is annoying because the Snyder Cut of Justice League already had a far superior visualization of the Speed Force. Why not keep this? Oh yeah, and they used their VFX to make puppets out of dead people's faces. We're coming back to that because boy howdy am I pissed about that, but for the meantime, I'm done ragging on this movie on a visual level. Let's talk about the story. The first major thing that sticks out to me about this script is its tone, or rather its inability to decide what tone to go for. See, the catalyst for this movie is Barry Allen's drive to save his mother Nora from being killed by an unspecified attacker. You would think that a movie that deals directly with this pivotal moment in Barry's life and the consequences it's had on him as a person would at least kind of take itself seriously, wouldn't you?
Nope.
Instead, much of the movie is played off as a comedy. And I don't mean that it's unintentionally funny due to terrible movie-making choices, though there is some of that from time to time. No, I mean this movie is directed as a comedy. Throughout the movie, you'll find goofy one-liners and visual bits that are clearly meant to be crack-up hilarious. But here's the thing, they're not. In fact, the humor actively drags the stakes of this movie down at several points. Take the now infamous opening scene, where Barry saves people at Gotham General Hospital. In concept, there's the potential for a really cool scene here where we can see what Barry can really do when he puts his mind to it. But instead, it's played off as a joke. Barry spends the whole scene whinging about how he's the Justice League's janitor and the fact that nobody takes him seriously. He smashes open a vending machine to comedically stuff his face to keep his energy up during the ordeal. He stuffs a baby into a goddamn microwave, then later removes said baby from said microwave with a smile that rivals that of the Joker's. This is clearly meant to be funny, but the problem is the humor doesn't land. Instead, it's so out of left field and bizarre that you're left wondering whether you should have smoked that spliff before watching this movie. What doesn't help is that this whole scene is preceded by a bit where Barry faces off against the worst cafe barista you've ever seen. This scene genuinely feels like it belongs in an episode of Seinfeld.
Yeah, I have to go to work 3 minutes ago, and sorry, I'm in sort of a rush for the sandwich.
You can't rush a good sandwich, dude.
And this is the trouble with the comedy throughout. It pretty consistently gets in the way of every single scene it's placed in, leading to a frustrating tonal inconsistency that makes it impossible to care about anything that's happening in the movie. So why? Why make this movie this stupid? What is it in aid of? Audience attention span. I'm not suggesting that this movie had to be dumb because the stupid plebeians wouldn't understand it otherwise. The opposite, in fact. The studios that make these movies appear terrified of allowing anything to play out seriously for longer than 2 seconds. From what I can tell, observing a lot of modern pop cinema, comedy is considered absolutely necessary because the studios seem under the impression that we stop paying attention when we're not laughing. So humor is injected into the proceedings unnaturally in an attempt to keep us engaged. But it has the opposite effect. The inappropriate nature of this humor only pulls us out of the movie and kills the stakes dead. More than that though, it suggests that the writers don't care about what's happening. It's all a silly comic, so they don't take it seriously. But if the writers don't give a shit, then how are we as an audience expected to care? It's maddening. I'm not suggesting this movie should have been a humorless sad fest either, because that would have been a different kind of aggravating, but killing the stakes with humor that clearly doesn't belong there is going too far in the other direction. And it's everywhere in current cinema. This movie is just especially bad for it. And this isn't even touching the dialogue. I have since misplaced the notes from which I derived my commentary of this film, so I can no longer cite any specific examples. This is a very well planned and researched video on a high quality channel. But the overall impression I got from the dialogue of this film is that the screenwriters had maybe heard human interaction one time and figured, hey, we can give that a go too. And here's the thing, I'm not exactly expecting snappy Aaron Sorkin repartee from a movie about a guy who runs fast. I am aware that by virtue of genre, some of the dialogue involved is going to be cheesy. But when it's less a cheese problem and more like sounding like two chatbots trying to have a conversation, it becomes something that grates on the ears. Now, these tonal and dialogue problems really should not be much of a shock. As I said at the beginning, there are 4 people credited with the script as it exists. Birds of Prey writer Christina Hodson wrote the screenplay, and a story by credit goes to whoever these guys are. However, they were far from the only ones to touch this story. Buckle in, I'm going to speedrun the history of this screenplay as best I can. So, all the way back in 2004, Batman Begins screenwriter David S. Goyer began a screenplay for a Flash film that he would direct himself, one in which he was going to cast Ryan Reynolds as Wally West after working with him on Blade Trinity. It's not that funny. Fortunately, disaster was averted here when in 2007, Goyer decided he didn't want to make the movie anymore over creative differences with Warner Brothers. Sean Levy was hired to replace him as director, the Night at the Museum guy, and he was tasked with directing a retooled version of Goyer's script written by Chris Brancato. Later that year, Levy pissed off to do Night at the Museum 2, and some bloke named David Bobkin stepped in as director, intending on retooling the movie as a spin-off to a Justice League movie that George Miller was going to make at the time. A movie that obviously never happened. Somewhere around here, Brancato's script was either reworked or thrown out entirely under the supervision of writer Craig Wright. Then the 2007 WGA strike happened, so no one was doing any writing for a while, and the project kind of dissolved. Skip to 2009, and producer Charles Roven tried to get a Flash movie off the ground again with an entirely new screenplay written by Dan Mazzone, based on a treatment written by famed DC Comics writer Jeff Johns. Then Green Lantern came out, and Warner Brothers decided it would be clever to throw out whatever Mazzone and Johns had written in favor of a new screenplay written by Green Lantern writing team of Greg Berlanti, Michael Green, and Mark Guggenheim. Because obviously, Green Lantern did so well. So let's take stock. The DCEU hasn't even started yet, and already 8 separate writers have been involved in trying to get the Flash off the ground. So anyway, the DCEU gets invented, and whatever the hell had been going on before then was probably thrown out and ignored entirely. It's extremely likely none of this bollocks had anything to do with this movie being the mess it is, but it's entertaining trying to make sense of it all, so I'm keeping it. Anyway, by 2015, famed duo Lord and Miller had written a script treatment ready to go for The Flash, a treatment they were fully prepared to write out and direct themselves. However, they decided to go make Solo for Star Wars instead, which clearly worked out for them, and Seth Grahame-Smith entered the scene to write and direct The Flash based on Lord and Miller's treatment. He then left in 2016, citing creative differences. This comes up a lot with this movie, but Warner Brothers kept hold of his script. Anyway, they then hired director Rick Famuyiwa, who would go on to do his own revision of Grahame-Smith's screenplay, one that worked in Cyborg and Wonder Woman. But in 2017, Famuyiwa left the project, citing, you guessed it, creative differences. At this point, the movie was put on hold while Ezra Miller went to film Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of J.K. Rowling, and Warner Brothers went looking for yet another new director. At this point, Joby Harold was hired to rewrite the script from square one, at which point the movie was saddled with the title Flashpoint. It is unclear if this movie was already intended to be a Flashpoint adaptation before this point, but the inclusion of Cyborg in previous drafts suggests to me it was, as Victor Stone is a major player in the Flashpoint timeline in the comic books. Somewhere around here, Dan Mazzone, hey, remember him, was brought back in to contribute to the script. In what capacity? Who knows? After not being able to get Robert Zemeckis in to direct, in 2018 Warner Brothers brought in John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein to write and direct the film, and the pair rewrote the script again. This writer and director team geared up to direct, but then Ezra Miller pissed off to film Fantastic Beasts, the botched gay representation of Dumbledore. Then somewhere in 2019, dear old Ezra said they were working on another version of the script with the help of All-Star Superman author Grant Morrison. However, Warner Brothers told Miller and Morrison their script was bollocks and threw it out. Not long after this, Daley and Goldstein decided they didn't want to do this shit anymore, and Warner Brothers commissioned one last draft of the screenplay. The one used at last, the one written by Christina Hodson. 18. In that nearly 20-year-long saga of trying to get this movie off the ground, 18 different writers. 19 if you count Dan Mazeau twice, because his involvements in different drafts were 8 years apart. And if we throw out all the pre-DCEU drafts, that's still 11 different people involved in writing this. And that's ignoring the rumor that's floating around that more than 20 more people were involved at some point in this mess. This ridiculous saga puts the fraught history of the 1978 Superman film script to shame. It's no wonder it turned out to be as gigantic a mess as it was in the end. And even with 11 different people involved, they still couldn't come up with anything more creative than a goddamn Flashpoint adaptation.
It's time to stop, okay? No more!
The Flash, as a character, has existed for ages. Barry Allen was first introduced all the way back in 1956, and was the Flash for the mainline series until Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1985. There are a bajillion stories in that nearly 30-year run to adapt, I am sure of it, but instead, since 2011, everyone keeps making the same one over and over and over and see, the main thing for me is that it just straight up does not make sense to make the Flash's first solo movie a Flashpoint adaptation. The idea of Flashpoint is that we had decades of history with the character that came before it. So when Barry finally does go back to save his mother and change his history, the consequences of that action actually land. But here it can never work. We haven't grown to be attached enough to the DCEU's Barry Allen for this to work. So instead, it comes off as incredibly shallow. It's like adapting the iconic The Death of Superman comics 2 movies into your shared universe. Good thing that didn't happen. The other key result of this rushed slipshod approach to this iconic story is that it loses most of its scope. See, in the comics, there's this whole thing about the Themyscirians and the Atlanteans being at war and how that's tearing the world apart. If a Flashpoint movie had been done in a more fleshed out DC film universe, we might have been able to capture the scope of that battle. But instead, they try to shove the Flashpoint storyline into the mess that the DCEU is in general. As a result, the scope is lost. The damage Barry did to the timeline is barely felt outside of Superman not being there and Eric Stoltz being in Back to the Future. The impact is lost. It feels toothless. Another thing that derails this Flashpoint adaptation from the word go is the inciting incident, the murder of Nora Allen. In the comics, it is established that Nora's death, the incident that set Barry Allen on the path to become the Flash, was at the hands of Reverse Flash, or Professor Zoom. Eobard Thawne has used both names. Reverse Flash, for those who are unaware, is basically the world's biggest hater. He literally wakes up every day and says to himself, how can I ruin Barry's life today? One day, he decided the best way to mess with Barry was to just straight up murder his mum. It was me, Barry. I killed her. Lamau Ruffle. The ultimate irony of Flashpoint is the fact that Reverse Flash's act of petty vengeance is actually what created the Flash in the first place, and that to save the timeline, Barry has to let his worst enemy kill his mother. It's pretty tragic. But in this movie, we don't have Reverse Flash. Instead, some guy just wanders into the Allens' home, sees Nora, and just stabs her. See, I know why they use Flashpoint here. It's because Warner Brothers are wussies. They couldn't let Barry Allen stand on his own in his own movie. No, that would be taking a risk. Instead, they needed to shove other characters awkwardly into the movie so they could bait people into theaters with easily marketable characters like Batman. And Flashpoint is the easiest story to do that with, so here we are, except they couldn't even get that right. Now, some changes work nicely. In concept, I like the idea of Kara being the Kryptonian that lands on Earth instead of Kal-El in the Flashpoint universe, partially just because I really like Kara in this movie, or I would if they gave her more to do, but more on that later. But where this movie really fails the Flashpoint story is in its handling of Batman. For those who may not know, in the original Flashpoint comic, in the alternate universe Barry created, the death of the Waynes happens very differently. In this universe, it's Bruce who gets killed in the alley. The result is that his parents go mad with grief. Thomas becomes Batman to seek vengeance for his son, and Martha cracks entirely and becomes the Joker. When I first heard that this movie was going to be another Flashpoint story, I rolled my eyes a bit, but was at least intrigued to see a live-action Thomas Wayne Batman. But no, Warner Brothers were too big of wusses to do even that. What did they do instead? A nostalgia trip of the Tim Burton Batman movies, of course. Not only is this aggravating from a nostalgia bait perspective, which I will return to, but it also means that the movie has to, by nature, be incomprehensible to work. See, Nora Allen's murder happens long after the death of the Waynes in this universe. So for the timeline to change so that Batman is 20 years older in Flashpoint than he is for the main timeline, they have to improvise some new time travel rules. And they make no sense. I don't want to spend too much time on this because other people have gone more in depth about how broken the time travel is in this movie, but here are the basics. Essentially, the idea here is that when you change the past, instead of creating a divergent timeline, a la Back to the Future, you instead bring into existence an intersecting timeline, where everything before and after the event you changed is also affected. Now again, it's pretty clear to me why this was written this way. They were very clearly working backwards from wanting old Bruce Wayne in this movie, so they had to come up with a reason why changing an event that happened in the early 2000s would lead to time being changed as far back as the 1950s. But Michael, you may well be asking, maybe they were just trying to do something new with time travel. How do you know it was retroactively shoved into the shape to make old Bruce Wayne work? I'm glad you didn't ask. The major evidence that this is contrived bullshit is that it flatly contradicts both events that happened before and after this explanation in the movie and in previous movies. See, the finale of the movie revolves around the idea of two Barrys of the movie running back in time over and over again to try and save Bruce and Kara's lives. The language of the movie suggests that all they're doing is rewinding time back to the moment that they die. But according to the rules of the movie, as explained to us by Bruce and his bowl of spaghetti, it shouldn't work like that. By those rules, they should be consistently hopping into other intersecting timelines every time they run to change the events of their deaths. But the movie doesn't present it that way. It just presents it as a simple Superman flying back in time deal like from the 1978 Superman movie. It's contradicting itself. Okay, you might say, maybe you're reaching here. And you're right, maybe I am. But you know what's not a reach? That these new rules flatly contradict events that happened before this movie. See, this movie is canon to specifically the Snyder Cut of Justice League. There are textual clues to that thrown in across the movie, including this bit where Bruce and Barry directly reference the final battle of the Snyder Cut. In that battle, Steppenwolf actually succeeds in destroying the world, but then Barry runs back in time and stops that from happening. In that movie, it is a cut and dry time rewinding situation. No intersecting timelines or any of that bullshit. So these new rules, as set by the Flash movie, actively contradict that movie too. So yeah, it's pretty obvious that they threw that scene with the spaghetti in there to justify old Bruce Wayne, forgetting to actually, you know, make it make sense. When I began writing this review, I thought I had more to say about Keaton Batman's turn in this movie, but it turns out I don't. My derision for his appearance is pretty straightforward, that being that he's clearly there for fan service and his function in the movie could have been filled out by almost anybody else. Also, Keaton is trying to pretend he gives a shit, but clearly doesn't. No, I'm far more interested in the other superhero that appears alongside Barry Allen in this movie, that being Kara Zor-El. Sasha Calle is the best thing about this movie. Heading into this movie, I don't think I made it a secret at all to people I know that the only part of this movie I cared about in any fashion was going to be Kara. Ezra Miller's take on Barry Allen has always annoyed me, and they need to answer for their crimes, and Michael Keaton's return to Batman had me feeling exactly nothing. But all the photos and reviews of Kaya as Kara had me really excited. Now yes, I was still of the opinion that it was annoying that Warner Brothers were too big of wusses to allow Barry Allen to stand alone in his own movie, but Supergirl was there. So I was excited to see what Kaya could do, and she did not disappoint. Kaya's performance is far and away the best in the movie. She's not given much to do, which I will return to, but she makes mountains of what she's given. Kaya brings an intense power to the role, one that sold me way more on Kara's abilities than any of the visual effects work ever did. I know that the DCU is set to be pretty much entirely rebooted with an all-new cast to fill the roles of the iconic characters, but if Sasha Calle doesn't get another shot at this role, I'm gonna be legitimately very upset. She, without a doubt, has the talent and the charisma to carry her own movie, and if she ever gets one, I will be seated front row for it. Also, how do I politely say that I wanted to punch a hole through me? Unfortunately, the writing lets her down quite a bit. See, all of Kara's character comes from Kaya's performance. On paper, there's nothing. There's what I'll generously call an attempt at characterization, but it's blasted through in about 5 minutes before she's unceremoniously written out in the worst way possible. Let's recap. About halfway through the movie, the two Barrys and Batman realize they need help to fight off Zod, so they go to find who they believe to be Kal-El, who's being kept in a Russian gulag or something. How do they know where to find the Kryptonian? I don't know, Bruce worked it out off screen or something. Anyway, they get there and find Kara instead of Kal-El, and Barry 1 insists they save her anyway. So they bust out, Kara insta-powers up in the yellow sunlight and wrecks the Russians incredibly violently, or at least it would be if not for the comically bad ragdoll CGI models of the dying Russians. The new gang make it back to America, where Kara powers up some more, then pisses off because she doesn't feel like she owes the humans anything after being locked up, which, fair. Except she almost instantly goes back on it the moment she sees Zod kill a guy and returns to the Batcave to help Barry power up. Oh yeah, Barry lost his powers. Don't worry about it.
I've got you.
It should have been me, not him!
Okay, I'm done being down bad now. Probably. Yeah, so now that Barry's back, she announces that she's gonna help them fight Zod, and they go to fight him. She beats up Zod for a bit, and Kaya gets to demonstrate again just how much she's elevating the material given to her.
What did you do to Kal-El?
Your sacrifice that...
What did you do?
This bit is especially telling as to how much Kaya is making this all better, because it is beyond clear that Michael Shannon wishes he were anywhere else. Not really the point though. Anyway, so then Kara dies. Multiple times. Beyond this being a frustrating disrespect towards a character as cool as Kara Zor-El, it's just a really shitty trope. It's no secret that DC has a bit of a problem with women in fridges. They are in fact the comic company that resulted in that term being a thing after Kyle Rayner's girlfriend got murdered and stuffed into a fridge for shock value. I had kinda hoped we'd be beyond this, but it's pretty explicit that Kara is killed here mostly for Barry 2's character motivation. See, he has a bit of a crush on Kara, which fair, so when she dies, he runs back in time to stop it from happening. Now, you might say, well yeah, but he was also running to save Batman too, and yeah, technically, but it's Kara's death that the movie keeps showing on repeat. Bruce only dies twice on screen. Kara gets killed over and over, both in the real world and in images in the Speed Force. So yeah, this is fridging. Fuck you, Muschietti. It's particularly annoying because, as I said, Kaya is putting her heart and soul into this role, but her character is treated like total shit. I'm so desperate for her to get a fair crack at this role one day so she can prove herself as a worthy addition to the DC universe and show the world at large that Supergirl is a character who should be taken as seriously as her more famous cousin. Kara Zor-El is a really awesome character, but most of her media outside of comics is kind of shit. If it sounds like I'm teasing a video on the 1984 Supergirl movie, don't worry, it's because I am. But somehow the treatment of Kara's character isn't even the most annoying or offensive part of this movie. Oh no, there's something far, far worse that made my blood boil just thinking about it, and that is the Speed Force cameo scene. Calling these cameos is in fact a hugely generous usage of that word. Because outside of Helen Slater and Nick Cage showing up just to be de-aged, none of the appearances here are actual cameos by the actors. They're all computer-generated reconstructions of people. As you may well have gathered, I hate this scene with every single fiber of my soul. I try not to use energy in my life for hate on movies these days. I find it clouds my judgment on any actual criticism of the film, and 80% of the time, it really isn't that deep. But I am making an exception for this moment in this movie because it really is that vile. Yes, CGI puppets of Christopher Reeve and George Reeves appear in this movie as, hey, I know that one, fan wank references. And people have already been up in arms enough about the posthumous usage of Chris Reeves' face in this movie, and rightly so. As I've covered ad nauseum on this channel, the production of his Superman films was highly troubled. A lot of the time, Reeve was the only man on set who truly had a clue what Superman was all about. He gave his heart and soul to the role, only to be consistently screwed by Warner Brothers and Canon Pictures. So to see Warner Brothers pull his face out of a hat and go, hey, remember this one? While a bastardization of John Williams' iconic theme plays in the background, was bad enough. But the far more offensive one was the one right before it, where they flashed George Reeves' face in front of us in his costume from The Adventures of Superman, in black and white too. Get it? Because his TV show was in black and white? George Reeves isn't as well known outside the Superman fandom as Chris Reeve is, so some important context. Towards the end of the run of The Adventures of Superman, Reeves was weary of the role. Much though he gave it his everything, he still felt trapped in it. During the run of the show, he wasn't allowed to take on any other contracts, lest that break the spell of him being Superman for the kiddies. Once the show finished, he couldn't escape the Man of Steel. He was consistently typecast, never allowing him to take on the roles he wanted. He felt trapped by the role of Superman, and it drove him into a depression. And eventually, he would lose his life to that depression. I'm in no way suggesting that Superman alone killed George Reeves, but the depression he felt at being pigeonholed into the role definitely appeared to be a factor. So for Warner Brothers to drag him from his grave and stuff him back into the Superman suit that he tried so desperately to escape from, it's inhuman. The intention of the scene in the movie was to install nostalgia in the viewer or to celebrate history or some bullshit like that, but instead I felt sick. Let Reeves rest, you fucking monsters. Oh yeah, and the movie was released on George Reeves' birthday too, just to throw some more salt into that wound. I doubt that was intentional given the 6,000 delays the movie went through, but still. And the absolute worst thing about this is there's absolutely no narrative or thematic purpose for these cameos. They're just there. If this movie gave a shit, this sequence of colliding universes could have been an opportunity to celebrate the history of the Flash as a superhero. If you really wanted to do cheap nostalgia fanbait cameos, there were non-offensive ways of doing this. You could have edited in clips from the 1970s Flash series. You could have had Grant Gustin show up for 2 seconds. You could have edited in a quick shot of Bart Allen from Smallville. You could have played a Michael Rosenbaum voice clip from Justice League Unlimited. Would all of this have been schmaltzy and a little eye-roll inducing? Sure, but it would have at least been appropriate. But instead, Warner Brothers' abject fear of allowing the Flash to stand on his own 2 feet won, and instead, we got this shit. Remember how at the top of this video, I said that this movie could be the death bell of comic book filmmaking and that it represents everything that has gone wrong with the genre and format? A pretty bold claim to make, I fully grant you. But I genuinely feel like that point of view is completely justified, both in terms of the film itself and the history of nerd media that leads up to it. But I want to take a moment to really focus on it a bit more. Instead of my laundry list of points I've had so far, let's take a look at the bigger picture. What does this movie represent, really? The Flash represents an epidemic, not just in comic book movies, but in nerd media in general. That epidemic is one of essentially treating the audience like they're brainless children. Slipshod writing that doesn't stand up to even a second's thought, that doesn't actually serve as telling a story, but instead works to pander to the audience through unearned cameos, lackluster character returns, and assorted other forms of fanwank material with various levels of tastelessness. In short, cinematic universe writing. That's right, this is the bit where I'm gonna blame Doctor Who. Spoilers for a shit ton of Doctor Who, by the way. Doctor Who has a rich history of event storytelling, beginning all the way back in 1969, where the 6th season finale, The War Games, an incredible 10-episode serial, introduces for the first time the Time Lords, the almost omnipotent race the Doctor hails from and has spent the past 6 seasons of TV hiding from. For the 10th anniversary 4 years later, they brought back the actors who played the first 2 incarnations of the Doctor to play alongside the 3rd. This was repeated 10 years later with the 5 Doctors. Skip ahead to 2008, to the 2-part finale of the revival's 4th series, The Stolen Earth: Journey's End, the episodes we will be blaming today. This 2-parter was a massive undertaking, bringing back characters from across all of the 10th Doctor's run in the TARDIS for one last battle, a fight against the might of the Daleks and their maniacal creator Davros. I can't stress enough how awesome this 2-parter was to me as a child. It's a relentless series of punches of beloved characters, culminating in a true modern-day applause break moment where K9 appears to save the day. This is a very fun 2-parter. It was also the beginning of the end. See, in all the previous examples of Doctor Who event storytelling, the big event was well justified in the text of the serial. In the War Games, the Time Lords are introduced because the Doctor realizes he's in way over his head trying to fight the Warlord and his offsider, another renegade Time Lord named the War Chief. Out of desperation to save the lives of the people being manipulated by the Lord and the Chief, he calls the Time Lords for help. This results in still the most chilling display of the Time Lords' power as they swoop in, erase the Warlord from existence, and then for an encore force the Doctor to regenerate, which is essentially an execution, and dump him on the Earth in the 1970s completely helpless. In The 3 Doctors, these seemingly omnipotent Time Lords come under attack from a force so strong they break several of their own laws about time travel, throwing all 3 incarnations of the Doctor into the fray to fix it because they know he's the only one with the imagination needed to fight this foe, also because they consider him expendable. I could go on, but you get the idea. These are are big events in the series, but the writers ensured that it was an important mechanic in the story, not just an audience applause break. Otherwise, it would have felt cheap. Now, we come to Journey's End. This is where the cameos and callbacks across the series begin to feel a bit cheap. Now, in concept, a lot of it isn't completely contrived. The Daleks are laying waste to Earth, so obviously characters like Captain Jack of Torchwood or Martha Jones, who works for UNIT after her time with the Doctor, would get involved. Rose Tyler and her gang coming back from the alternate timeline Rose got locked in 2 seasons ago makes sense, because across the 4th series it's been established that the barriers between the universes are collapsing and Rose is on her way to find out why and help put a stop to it. Davros's return is extremely well earned. The last time we saw the Daleks, there was only one left in all of existence, so bringing back the creator of the Daleks to resurrect his murderous fascist dustbins works perfectly. But some of it begins to push towards what I'll call here on in the "hey, I know that one" moment. Harriet Jones being there, for example. Her function in the story is to get the gang together and then die. It's a function that could have been fulfilled by anybody else, unlike the roles that Jack, Martha, and most of the others fill. K9 showing up at the end is another example. It even has the pacing of a cameo reveal in a Marvel movie. So some of it feels a little cheap in retrospect, but overall it feels earned. This massive fan service filled 2-parter is something of a precursor of what was to come in the Marvel Cinematic Universe with the double act of Infinity War and Endgame. In fact, I once remember reading that Kevin Feige had in fact seen Journey's End and took some inspiration on how to handle the massive amount of returning characters and reference involved in Endgame from Doctor Who. I can now no longer find where I read that, so feel free to take it with the smallest grain of salt, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. Much like Journey's End, Infinity War and Endgame's fan service, returning characters and cameos all feel completely earned. I've since fallen out of love with those movies for artistic reasons, but I cannot fault them on their planning and making sure that this finale to the Infinity Saga felt satisfying and earned. There are a couple of cringy fan service moments, but overall, it's very well done. But from here, things take a turn for the worse. See, the lesson that should be taken from Doctor Who's rich history of event storytelling and the monolith that is Infinity War and Endgame is that to bring all of these elements together, you have to tell a compelling story that earns the scale you're shooting for. If you go to tell us where the Doctor's from, make sure the circumstances he's in are so dire he no longer has a choice but to call for help. If you're going to put 3 doctors in one room, make sure it's a threat you need 3 doctors to fight. If you're going to have every superhero in your universe in one movie, you make sure it's a battle that demands that gravitas. But most importantly, respect your audience. That is not the lesson that has been learned. Indeed, the main takeaway that media in general seems to have had from these stories is more characters equals good. Instead of the well-earned return of a character, we have the "hey, I know that one" moment. The result of this focus on dangling recognizable characters in front of us like a mobile above a baby's cot is that the story being told becomes less important. The narrative is no longer the important part is the audience applause break. My personal alarm bells have been going off in this respect since Endgame, but I remember Spider-Man No Way Home being the moment when I realized this was infecting nerd media to a concerning extent. That film was clearly written around the concept of getting 3 Spider-Men into one film, as opposed to telling a truly great story that involves 3 Spider-Men. And sure, it mostly works. The last time I watched it, I had a good time, but the cracks are really obvious. Characters stop and almost turn to the camera to say an iconic line. The movie literally pauses for 2 seconds every time an older Spider-Man enters the film so the audience can applaud. The story is no longer the focus here. The fan services. And this trend continues through Marvel movies and the Book of Boba Fett, and somewhat fittingly, back to Doctor Who. The Power of the Doctor tries to recapture the huge scale of Journey's End, but it feels astonishingly unearned there. Much though I personally love seeing Janet Fielding and Sophie Aldred slipped right back into their characters, there's no actual reason for them to be there. Furthermore, to anyone who hasn't seen the classic era, their presence is incoherent. References are made to classic stories. Old Doctors return for cameos where they say their iconic lines, but none of it feels like it matters because it's not a part of the story. Instead, it's been tacked on. It feels hollow. Moreover, we start to hit the point where the drive to have a reference to something older flies in the face of actually respecting the thing you're referencing. Again, an example can be found in Doctor Who in the Series 8 finale, Death in Heaven. To those unfamiliar, here's the Cliff Notes. This is Missy, an incarnation of the Doctor's age-old enemy, the Master. In this episode, she's reincarnating the dead as Cybermen, emotionless cyborgs basically, to raise an army for the Doctor that he never asked for. She's also using a piece of Time Lord technology to capture the minds of the recently deceased, strip them of their emotions, then download them into the bodies of the Cybermen. This show is weird. Jumping back like 40 years for more context, this is Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart. Through the early 70s, he was a major player on Doctor Who, playing either the straight man to the Doctor's antics or the fish out of water to the sci-fi elements, depending on what the show needed him to do at the time. He's an extremely beloved character. His dry sarcasm in the face of adversity and his utter indignation at the Doctor's bullshit being something that I personally loved about him. His fan favorite status means he's come back a couple of times across the show, coming out of retirement for one last adventure at least twice in the series canon. Wait, 3 times. I'd forgotten Mordrin Undead happened. Nicholas Courtney, the actor who brought the Brigadier to life, passed away in 2011. In the year of his passing, his death was marked by a touching moment in the Series 6 finale where the Doctor phones his family looking for the Brigadier and learns he died. In this episode, it's an extremely touching moment and also acts to pay tribute to the friendship he and the Doctor shared for years. Given that I've mentioned a beloved character and cursed cybernetic necromancy in the past 5 minutes, I'm sure you can guess the direction Death in Heaven is headed in. Yep, that's right, the Brigadier is literally ripped from the grave so he and the Doctor can share what is supposed to be a very touching moment where the Doctor salutes his friend. I saw this episode go out live in 2014. I was 15 years old and already kind of jaded towards the show for both legitimate and stupid reasons. So when this beloved character was dragged out of the grave in an attempt of fan service, I didn't clap or cheer or brush a tear from my cheek as Stephen Moffat probably intended. Instead, I felt almost sick with rage, and me and my mum nearly threw things at the TV. Until this year, it remained the most disrespectful thing I'd ever seen a show do to a legacy character, and I assumed it was a bar that could not possibly be lowered. And that takes us back to The Flash. The Flash represents the only logical endpoint for this kind of poorly justified fan service heavy writing in media. Once you remove the storytelling from the equation, all you're left with is a series of references to things that you already know. Sure, the film pretends to be a Flashpoint adaptation, but that's not the actual point of the movie. It isn't actually about Barry Allen's struggle to come to terms with the death of his mother. Instead, it's about having Michael Keaton come back as Batman. It's about getting everyone to stand up and applaud when he says, for no reason by the way,
You want to get nuts? Let's get nuts.
And once you've mined all the references you can make to people who are still alive, the next step is to start mining the graves of those who have already passed on to do so. And once you throw any respect for the dead or the fans out the window, you get the Brigadier's corpse in a Cyberman suit or CGI George Reeves and Chris Reeve. It's no longer about paying respect to the history. Instead, it's a cynical representation in the hopes that we just clap and cheer because, hey, I know that one. And this is why The Flash makes me so angry, because I know with absolute certainty it could have been better than this. I've seen so many stories that have been fan service heavy that have had respect for its history and its audience. But instead we got this. And the question is why? Because it's easy. Stories like The War Games or Journey's End are not easy to write. It takes time and effort to put the pieces together in a way that feels earned and is respectful to both the audience and the things you are referencing. But when the bottom line is the more important thing, when you're churning out n number of movies and TV shows a year in order to make billions of recognizable products, you don't have time to care about things like respect or what the fans actually want. So instead, familiar faces and lines are cynically dangled in front of us, barely threaded together with half thought out stories. And the worst bit is, it works. When I watched Power of the Doctor, I knew I was being pandered to the whole time and found myself feeling almost offended the whole time. But in moments where the Doctor references his dead friend Adric, or when William Russell returned to play his character from 1963 at the age of 90, it worked. I knew it was pandering, but all the same, I felt that excitement. In those moments, I got that excitement of, hey, I know that one. But it only works in the moment. There's no actual value to it. It's just a temporary buzz. And unfortunately, in general, that buzz is what people will mostly remember. From what I can tell, the general reaction to The Flash was much the same. Everyone who saw it knew they were being pandered to. But the rush of the hey, I know that one moments involving Michael Keaton were enough to work. For me personally, the buzz of seeing Supergirl was almost enough to carry me through the latter half of the film, but it really isn't enough. But I don't think it's too late to fix this. If we start asking for more, demanding that the people who tell these stories actually show us and the franchises some damn respect, maybe things can change. Maybe if we all demand better, The Flash won't be the death flag of comic book filmmaking like I dramatically suggested it would be 40 minutes ago. Maybe it will eventually just be a mistake we can learn from or forget entirely. But that can only happen if we say this isn't good enough. I have hope for the future of these franchises, I really do. The return of Russell T Davies to Doctor Who, the man who wrote Journey's End, seems like a step in the right direction. The induction of James Gunn as head of the DCU, someone who really understands comic books, sheds a hopeful light on the future of DC. But hope alone won't undo the damage done by this form of writing. We need to demand better. Otherwise, the future of media isn't stories like The War Games or Journey's End. It's films like The Flash.